There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, moments that don't announce themselves with thunder or trumpets, but with the quiet weight of a head on your shoulder. They are the fault lines, the unseen tectonic shifts that rearrange the entire landscape of your heart before you've even had a chance to register the tremor. You only understand their significance in retrospect, when you look back and see that the world you inhabited before that quiet moment is a foreign country, a place to which you can never return. For me, that moment smelled of rain-damp wool and the faint, clean scent of Leo's shampoo, and it was the beginning of everything. He was asleep. Or, at least, he was performing a convincing facsimile of sleep, his breathing a deep and even tide against the shell of my ear. His head rested in the crook of my neck, a heavy, trusting weight that seemed to anchor me to the worn cushions of my old sofa. Outside, a relentless November rain lashed against the window panes, each drop a tiny silver nail hammering the city into a state of submission. Inside, the only sounds were the rhythmic sigh of Leo's breath and the frantic, chaotic drumming of my own heart, a trapped bird beating its wings against the cage of my ribs. This was the third time in 2 weeks we had ended up like this, a strange and unspoken ritual born from his recent, spectacular heartbreak. He would come over under the guise of watching a movie or just escaping his own suddenly too empty apartment, and somewhere between the opening credits and the third act, he would drift off, his body slowly, incrementally, seeking solace against mine. Every rational part of my brain, the part that had spent the last 4 years carefully constructing fortifications around my feelings for him, screamed at me to move, to shift, to cough, to do anything that would break this fragile, dangerous proximity. Leo was my best friend. Leo was, by his own frequent and cheerful admission, hopelessly, irrevocably straight. He was the sun around which my quieter, more observational planet had found a steady orbit. He was all bright laughter and easy confidence, a man who collected friends and experiences with a casual grace that I could only ever admire from a distance. And for 4 years, I had been a disciplined astronomer of our friendship, charting his course, celebrating his light, but always maintaining a safe and respectful distance. I had learned to live with the quiet ache of my affection, compartmentalizing it into a locked room in the architecture of my soul, a room whose existence he would never suspect. But this was different. This was a slow, deliberate dismantling of all my defenses. His arm was draped loosely across my stomach, his fingers curled just shy of my hip. The warmth of him seeped through my t-shirt, a radiating heat that felt less like comfort and more like a brand. I could feel the fine hairs on his forearm against my skin, could count the individual threads in the chunky knit of his sweater where my chin rested against his hair. It was an intimacy so profound, so terrifyingly close to the thing I wanted most, that it felt like a form of exquisite torture. I was a man dying of thirst, and he was offering me a glass of salt water. With every breath he took, I was drowning a little more, lost in the impossible currents of what this might mean, and what it almost certainly did not. He was just seeking comfort. He was my friend. He was grieving a relationship. This was platonic. It had to be. But my heart, that foolish, traitorous organ, refused to listen to reason. It only listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing and whispered a single, dangerous word. Hope. Our story didn't begin in a storm, but in the quiet, sterile light of a university darkroom. I was a photography student, lost in the alchemical process of coaxing images from blank paper, my world smelling perpetually of developer and stop bath. Photography was my native language. I was more comfortable speaking through a lens than with my own voice. I was cataloging life, not living it, and for the most part, I was content with that arrangement. The darkroom was my sanctuary, a place of controlled magic where I could develop the world according to my own vision, bringing light from darkness, order from emulsion. Leo was a software engineering major who had signed up for an introductory photography class on a whim, thinking it would be an easy arts credit. He burst into the hushed, red-lit sanctuary of the darkroom like a supernova, all kinetic energy and booming questions. He knocked over a tray of Fixer, exposed two other students' prints to the light, and somehow managed to get tangled in his own apron, all within the first 10 minutes. He was chaos personified, a vibrant, living disruption to my carefully curated stillness. I remember watching him from my corner, a mixture of profound annoyance and grudging fascination churning within me. He was clumsy, loud, and utterly artless in this delicate space, yet he moved with an unshakable confidence, a belief that any mistake could be laughed off, any problem could be solved with a charming grin. Our professor, a man of infinite and weary patience, finally assigned me to be his darkroom buddy, a sentence I initially interpreted as a form of cruel and unusual punishment. My job was to guide him through the basics, to prevent him from causing any further chemical disasters or accidental light leaks. I approached the task with the grim resignation of a zookeeper assigned to a particularly unruly primate. I showed him how to load film onto a developing reel in the pitch-black changing bag, my fingers guiding his larger, clumsier ones in the dark. I explained the precise timing required for the developer, the sharp, vinegary smell of the stop bath, the patient wash of the Fixer. I spoke in quiet, clipped sentences, all business, determined to keep a professional distance. But Leo was impossible to keep at a distance. He treated my terse instructions not as a sign of my introversion, but as a fascinating puzzle to be solved. He asked endless questions, not just about f-stops and shutter speeds, but about me. He wanted to know what I liked to shoot, why I preferred black and white over color, what story I was trying to tell with a particular photograph of a rain-slicked street. He didn't see my quietness as a wall. He saw it as a door and simply started knocking. He would hold up a dripping, poorly composed print of a campus squirrel with an expression of such earnest pride that I couldn't help but smile. He celebrated his small victories with a ridiculous fist pump and lamented his failures with a dramatic sigh, then would immediately ask, "Okay, what did I do wrong? Teach me, Alex." Slowly, begrudgingly, I found myself drawn into his orbit. His energy was infectious. He saw the world in bold, primary colors, while I saw it in shades of gray. He was all forward momentum, while I was all quiet reflection. He was the subject, and I was the observer. The dynamic felt natural, comfortable. Our tutoring sessions bled into coffee breaks, then into long study sessions at the library where he would try to explain the elegant logic of code to me, and I would try to explain the emotional logic of composition to him. We were speaking different languages, but somehow, we found a way to understand each other. I learned that his boisterous confidence was a shield for a deep-seated fear of not being smart enough, a remnant of a childhood spent in the shadow of an older, academically gifted brother. He learned that my silence wasn't born of arrogance, but of a shyness so profound it was almost a physical presence. The friendship solidified one afternoon when he saw a print I was working on for my portfolio. It was a portrait of an old man sitting on a park bench, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes staring at something far beyond the frame. Leo was quiet for a long time, a rare state for him. He just looked at the image, his usual energetic aura stilled. "It's like you can see him," he finally said, his voice soft. "Not just what he looks like, but who he is. How do you do that?" I mumbled something about light and shadow, about capturing a decisive moment. "No," he insisted, turning to look at me, his gaze unusually direct. "It's more than that. You see people, Alex. I think you see them better than they see themselves." That was the moment the lock on that secret room in my heart began to give way. No one had ever described my photography, or me, that way. He saw past the technical skill and saw the intent, the empathy. He saw me, and in that moment of being truly seen, the first seeds of a deeper affection were planted. Of course, I did nothing. I buried it deep. He was Leo. He dated a succession of bright, bubbly women who matched his own energy. He would tell me about his dates, agonize over text messages, and celebrate anniversaries, and I would play my part as the supportive best friend, the quiet confidant, the platonic rock. I became an expert in emotional subterfuge, my face a carefully composed photograph of friendly interest while my insides were a chaotic double exposure of longing and resignation. I told myself it was enough. Being his friend, being the one he trusted, was a privilege I would never risk. The thought of losing him was a darkness I couldn't bear to even contemplate, so I lived in the twilight, treasuring the reflected light of his friendship and telling myself it was the same as the sun. For 4 years, this delicate balance held. We graduated, moved into our own apartments in the same city, and navigated the treacherous currents of our first real jobs. He, as a consultant for a fast-paced tech firm, and me, as a freelance photographer, scraping by on portraits and small commercial gigs. Our lives were different, but our friendship was the constant, the anchor. We had weekly dinners, movie nights, and long, meandering conversations about everything and nothing. He was the one person I could be truly silent with, whose presence didn't demand performance. And I was, I think, a place of calm for him in his often frenetic life. I was the safe harbor, the steady hand. And I was so careful to never let the truth of my feelings disturb the water. I built my walls high and strong, and for 4 years, they were never breached. The first crack in the dam was Sarah. She was his longest relationship, a 2-year epic of dizzying highs and dramatic, crashing lows. She was a lawyer, sharp and ambitious, and from my perspective on the sidelines, she seemed to want to sand down all of Leo's wonderful, chaotic edges. She didn't understand his need for a sprawling circle of friends, his goofy sense of humor, his occasional bursts of spontaneous adventure. She saw them as immaturities to be managed. I watched as his light seemed to dim, his laughter became a little more forced, his energy a little more contained. He'd come over to my apartment after a fight with her, not to talk about it directly, but just to sit in the quiet, to breathe the air in a space that didn't have any expectations of him. He wouldn't say much, just stare at the contact sheets pinned to my wall or flip through a photography book, his shoulders slowly unknotting. I never said a word against her. It wasn't my place. I just kept my door open, the coffee pot on, and a neutral, listening ear ready. I was Switzerland, a demilitarized zone where he could find refuge without having to explain the war. My role was to be the constant, the unchanging variable in the tumultuous equation of his life. I had perfected the art of being essential but invisible, a structural support that you only notice if it's gone. It was a painful role, but it was the only one I knew how to play. Loving him from a distance had become a part of my identity, a dull, persistent ache so familiar it was almost comforting. It was the price of admission for having him in my life, and I paid it without complaint. The breakup, when it finally came, was not a surprise, but its ferocity was. It was a clean, brutal amputation. She had packed her things while he was on a business trip, leaving only a note on the kitchen counter and the keys he had given her. There was no final, explosive fight, no dramatic confrontation, just a sudden, deafening silence in the life they had built together. He called me from his apartment, his voice hollowed out, stripped of all its usual warmth and cadence. He didn't sound like Leo. He sounded like a stranger. "She's gone, Alex," was all he said. I was there in 20 minutes. I found him sitting on the floor of his living room, surrounded by the ghosts of their relationship. The bookshelf they had built together, the rug she had picked out, the faint indentation on the sofa cushion next to him where she used to sit. The air in the apartment was thick with absence. He looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, his eyes were completely unguarded. The usual bright spark was gone, replaced by a profound, desolate bewilderment. He looked like a man who had been shipwrecked, washed ashore in a land he didn't recognize. I didn't say much. There was nothing to say. Platitudes about fish in the sea or being better off without her would have been insults to the raw, gaping wound of his pain. So I just sat on the floor with him, my back against the sofa, and mirrored his silence. We sat like that for what felt like hours, the city lights beginning to glitter in the window as dusk settled. Eventually, he started to talk, not in a flood, but in broken fragments. He spoke of the note, of the shock, of the sudden, gut-wrenching realization that he was utterly alone. He wasn't just mourning her. He was mourning the future he had so confidently mapped out. It was in that moment that the shift occurred, the first subtle but significant change in the geology of our friendship. He stopped talking, his shoulders began to shake, and a sound tore from his throat, a dry, ragged sob that was more pain than sound. And then, without a word, he leaned sideways and rested his head on my shoulder. It was not a casual gesture. It was the desperate, instinctual act of a drowning man reaching for a life raft. My entire body went rigid. For 4 years, our physical contact had been limited to brief, backslapping hugs or the occasional playful shove. This was a language we had never spoken. I could feel the tremors of his crying through my own body, a seismic shockwave of his grief. My hand, of its own accord, lifted and settled on his back, rubbing slow, steady circles. It was all I could offer, a small, silent anchor in the storm of his sorrow. He eventually cried himself out, his breathing evening into a shuddering exhaustion. But he didn't move away. He stayed there, his head on my shoulder, his body slumped against mine, as if he had no strength left to hold himself up. And I stayed perfectly still, terrified that the slightest movement would break the spell, that he would realize what he was doing and pull away, embarrassed. I was his friend, providing comfort. That was the role. But the man inside me, the one who had loved him in silence for so long, was in agony. To have him this close, this vulnerable, was a cruel and beautiful kind of torture. It was everything I had ever wanted, offered to me for all the wrong reasons. The foundation of our friendship, which I had always imagined as solid bedrock, had just been revealed to be nothing more than a thin crust over a molten core of unspoken things. And I had no idea what would happen when it finally gave way. That night was the beginning of the ritual. He couldn't stand to be in his own apartment, a museum of a failed relationship, so he started spending most of his evenings at mine. My small, cluttered space, filled with the scent of chemicals and drying photo paper, became his sanctuary. At first, there was a pretense. We were watching movies, or I was helping him with a side project, or we were just hanging out like we always had. But the evenings would inevitably end the same way. We'd be on the sofa, a comfortable distance between us, and as the night wore on, the space would shrink. It was a slow, almost imperceptible migration, a hand brushing against mine on the cushion, a foot nudging my leg. Then, he would feign sleepiness, his head would start to nod, and he would list sideways until his head found its now familiar place in the crook of my neck. The first few times it happened, I was a wreck of anxiety. My body would be ramrod straight, my muscles screaming in protest at the forced stillness. I would spend hours analyzing every detail. Was his breathing really as deep as it sounded? Was that a genuine sleepy sigh, or was it something else? I was a detective searching for clues in a case where I desperately wanted to find a specific culprit. I became hyper-aware of everything. The subtle pressure of his leg against mine, the way his fingers would sometimes twitch and brush against my side, the soft puff of his breath against my skin. My senses were turned up to a painful, excruciating volume, cataloging data my heart was desperate to interpret as evidence. I was living in a state of suspended disbelief, a quantum reality where he was both just my grieving friend seeking platonic comfort and something more, something new and terrifyingly fragile. My internal monologue was a constant, looping debate. One side, the pragmatist, would list the facts. Leo is straight. Leo is heartbroken. Leo is using you as a human security blanket. Don't be an idiot, Alex. Don't mistake desperation for affection. But the other side, the hopeful, romantic fool, would whisper back, but no one has ever felt this safe with you. Look at how he trusts you. Look at the way he seeks you out, the way his body relaxes completely when he's near you. Maybe he's not drowning and grabbing onto the nearest raft. Maybe he's finally coming into harbor. This ritual became the new architecture of our friendship, a space we inhabited together that had no name and no clear rules. He never acknowledged it. The next morning, he would wake up on the sofa, usually after I had slipped away to my own bed in the early hours of the morning, unable to bear the intimacy a moment longer. He would stretch, run a hand through his messy hair, and act as if nothing had happened. "Morning," he'd say with a sleepy grin. "Man, your couch is dangerous." I always pass out. It was his get-out-of-jail-free card, his plausible deniability. And I, too afraid to call his bluff, always let him play it. I'd just offer him coffee, and we'd slip back into the comfortable, familiar roles of Alex and Leo. Best friends. We would talk about his work, my latest project, a funny video he saw online. We would talk about anything and everything except the 6 hours he had just spent asleep in my arms. The silence around it was colossal. It was a living, breathing entity in my apartment. We were building a new world together in the dark, and then pretending in the daylight that we had no memory of its construction. And the longer it went on, the more necessary it became. I could see the change in him. The nights he spent at my place, he slept. The hollows under his eyes began to fade. The frantic, anxious energy that had clung to him since the breakup began to dissipate. He was healing, and I was, apparently, the medicine. The thought was both gratifying and deeply unsettling. Was I just a utility? A means to an end? Or was there something else being woven in the quiet intimacy of those nights on my couch? My photography began to change. I had always been drawn to lonely landscapes and solitary figures, images that reflected my own internal state. But now, my lens started seeking out moments of connection. I found myself taking pictures of clasped hands, of strangers leaning against each other on the subway, of the way light pooled between two people sitting close together on a park bench. I was searching for a visual language to understand what was happening between Leo and me. I was trying to develop a picture that was still too dark to see clearly, holding it up to the light, waiting for the details to emerge from the silver halide fog. I was documenting the evidence of a feeling I was still too afraid to name, hoping the camera could see what I could not. One evening, the ritual escalated. We were watching some mindless action movie, the sound and fury on the screen a stark contrast to the quiet tension in the room. He had fallen asleep against me earlier than usual, seeming more exhausted than ever. The weight of him was familiar now, the initial shock replaced by a kind of chronic ache of longing. I was tracing the patterns on the ceiling with my eyes, my mind running its usual marathon of hope and doubt, when he stirred. He didn't wake up, not really, but he shifted, burrowing closer, his face pressing into my neck. His arm, which was usually just draped across my stomach, tightened, his hand coming to rest on my chest, directly over my heart. My breath hitched. I could feel his fingers, warm and firm, rising and falling with the frantic, jackhammer rhythm of my pulse. He had to feel it. He had to know. It was a confession my body was making without my consent. I froze, waiting for him to recoil, to pull away, for the illusion to shatter. This was it, the moment of reckoning. He would wake up, feel the ridiculously fast beat of my heart, and the unspoken thing between us would finally have to be spoken, and I would lose him. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the impact. But he didn't pull away. Instead, his thumb moved, just once, a slow, deliberate stroke against my t-shirt, right over the epicenter of my panic. It wasn't a convulsive, sleepy twitch. It was a conscious, soothing gesture. A gesture that said, "I know. It's okay. I'm here." Then he settled again, his breathing deepening back into the rhythm of sleep. The entire exchange lasted no more than 5 seconds, but it completely rewired my understanding of the universe. It was no longer a question of what I was imagining. It was a question of what we were both pretending not to know. That single, silent gesture had transformed the dynamic from one of an oblivious sleeper and a pining friend into a conspiracy between two people who had agreed not to speak the truth out loud. The deniability was gone, replaced by a shared, terrifying, and exhilarating secret. He knew, and he stayed. The weeks that followed existed in a strange, heightened reality. The ritual on the couch continued, but now it was charged with a new energy. The pretense of accidental sleep was thinner, more transparent. There was an intention in the way he would settle against me, a silent understanding that passed between us in the dark. The touch of his hand on my chest was no longer a shocking anomaly. It became a part of the ritual, a quiet confirmation. We were like two dancers who had learned a complex and intimate choreography without ever speaking a word about the steps. During the day, we were still just Alex and Leo. We talked about work, about friends, about the weather. But at night, on my worn-out sofa, we were something else entirely, something for which we had no name. This fragile ecosystem of unspoken things could not last. I knew it, and I think he knew it too. We were living on a fault line, and the pressure was building. I found myself becoming more and more anxious, the dual realities I was living becoming harder to reconcile. I was exhausted from the constant vigilance, from the emotional whiplash of being his everything in the dark and just his friend in the light. I felt like a photograph that had been left in the developer for too long, the image becoming darker and more obscure, the details lost to an overwhelming blackness. The hope that had once been a small, warm ember was now a raging fire, and I was terrified it would consume everything, leaving nothing but ash. I needed clarity. I needed a word. I needed to know if this house we were building was real, or if it was just a dream from which I would eventually have to wake up. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. It was a cold, miserable night, the kind of night that seeps into your bones. Leo had been quiet all evening, a different kind of quiet from his usual post-breakup melancholy. It was a tense, coiled silence, and it set me on edge. He sat at the far end of the couch, creating a chasm of space between us that felt more pronounced than ever before. The movie played, a generic comedy we weren't really watching, and the usual gravitational pull that drew him toward me seemed to have been shut off. He was a distant star, cold and remote. The credits rolled, and the silence that filled the room was heavy and suffocating. He didn't make a move to get up and leave, but he didn't make a move toward me either. He just sat there, staring at the blank television screen, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. I couldn't take it anymore. The ambiguity was a physical weight, crushing the air from my lungs. I had to know. Even if the answer destroyed me, it had to be better than this purgatory of not knowing. My voice, when I finally found it, was rough, a stranger's voice in my own throat. Leo? He turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting mine in the dim light of the lamp. His expression was guarded, unreadable. What are we doing? I asked, the words barely a whisper. He didn't pretend not to understand. There was no "what do you mean?" No attempt at deflection. He just held my gaze, and I could see a storm of conflict in his eyes. He looked scared. He looked lost. He looked, for the first time, as uncertain as I felt. I don't know, Alex, he said, his voice as quiet as mine. You come here every night. I pressed on, my heart pounding against my ribs like a fist. You fall asleep on me. You hold my hand. You touch my chest. I stumbled over the words, laying the evidence out between us, piece by painful piece. I need to know what that means. Because for me, it means something. And I'm going crazy not knowing if it means anything to you. The silence stretched, taut, and thin. I had done it. I had lit the match. I had risked everything. I watched his face, trying to read the verdict. I saw fear, yes, but underneath it, I saw a flicker of something else. Not anger, not disgust, something that looked like relief, as if he had been waiting for me to be the one to finally say it. He finally broke the silence, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't place. I can't be at my place. And when I'm here, with you, it's the only time I feel, he trailed off, searching for the word. It's the only time I feel quiet inside. It's the only time I feel safe. Safe, I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. So that's all it was. I was a safety blanket, a warm body to ward off the ghosts of his ex-girlfriend. The pragmatist in my head was screaming, I told you so. The disappointment was so sharp, so sudden, it felt like a physical blow. I started to pull away, to put distance between us, to rebuild the walls he had so carelessly dismantled. No, wait, he said, his voice urgent. He moved then, closing the distance between us in an instant. He reached out, not for my shoulder, not for my hand, but for my face. His palm was warm against my cheek, his thumb stroking my jawline. It was a gesture of such deliberate tenderness that it stopped my breath. He was looking at me with an intensity that stripped away all my defenses. The fear was still in his eyes, but now there was something else mingling with it. A raw, terrifying vulnerability. "It's more than that," he whispered, his eyes searching mine, begging me to understand something he didn't have the words for. "Alex, it's you. It's always been you. I didn't know. I didn't let myself know." And then he leaned in. It was a slow, hesitant movement, a question asked without words. He gave me every opportunity to pull away, to turn my head, to say no. His eyes never left mine, and in them, I saw the whole terrifying, beautiful truth of the past few months. He wasn't just seeking comfort. He was seeking me. I held my breath, my entire world narrowing to the few inches of space between our lips. This was the moment the photograph finally developed, the image coming into sharp, undeniable focus. I didn't pull away. I closed my eyes and met him halfway. The kiss was not what I had expected. For years, I had imagined this moment in 1,000 different ways, usually as something passionate and desperate, a dam breaking. But it was nothing like that. It was soft. It was tentative. It was unbelievably gentle. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was the taste of salt from the tears I hadn't realized were tracking down my face. It was the feeling of his thumb stroking my cheek, a steady anchor in the dizzying, overwhelming sea of emotion. It was less a physical act and more a confession, a silent exchange of all the words we hadn't been able to say. It was a promise of a new kind of quiet, a new kind of safety, one that we would build together. It was the sound of a lock turning and a door finally opening. The aftermath of a moment you have waited years for is a strange and disorienting landscape. The world should, by all rights, feel different. The colors should be brighter, the air itself charged with new meaning. But as we pulled apart, the air in my small living room felt thin and fragile, and the silence that fell between us was not the comfortable quiet of before, but something sharp-edged and fraught with uncertainty. Leo's hand was still on my cheek, his thumb tracing a nervous pattern against my skin. His eyes, when they met mine, were wide with a terrifying mixture of wonder and pure, undiluted panic. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was not yet sure if he had grown wings or if he was about to plummet. I had no idea what to say. The kiss had answered one question, but it had thrown open the door to 1,000 more. What were we now? What did this mean for him, for the entire identity he had built for himself? What did it mean for us? The carefully constructed reality of Alex and Leo, best friends, lay in ruins around us, and I was terrified of what we might build in its place, and even more terrified that we might build nothing at all. I could see the retreat beginning in his eyes, the shutters coming down, the confident, easygoing Leo frantically trying to reassert control over this new, bewildering territory he had just stumbled into. He pulled his hand back as if my skin had suddenly burned him. He stood up abruptly, pacing the small space between the sofa and the bookshelf, running a hand through his hair in a gesture I knew meant he was deeply agitated. He wouldn't look at me. He was creating distance, both physical and emotional, and every step he took away from me felt like a nail being driven into my chest. The beautiful, fragile intimacy of the kiss evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. I had misinterpreted everything. I had pushed him, and he had reacted, and now he was regretting it. The old narrative, the one where I was the fool hoping for the impossible, came rushing back with a vengeance. I should go, he stammered, his back still to me. "Leo," I said, my voice barely audible. "Don't. I can't do this, Alex," he said, turning to face me, and his expression was one of such profound inner conflict that it stole my breath. "I don't know what this is. I broke up with Sarah. I'm a mess. This isn't. I'm not." He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. "I'm not gay." The words hung in the air between us, unspoken but deafening. He was grabbing for his old identity like a life preserver, terrified of the new currents he was being pulled into. "So what was that?" I asked, my voice shaking with a hurt so deep it felt like a betrayal. "What have these last few weeks been? Was I just convenient? A stand-in until you felt better? The accusation hung in the air, ugly and raw. I wanted to take it back as soon as I said it, but it was too late. I saw the words land on him, saw him flinch as if I had struck him. "No," he said, his voice vehement. "No, it's not like that. It's not you. It's me. I'm confused." He looked at me, his eyes pleading. "You're my best friend, Alex. You're the most important person in my life. I can't lose you, and I feel like I'm about to destroy everything." He grabbed his jacket and was out the door before I could say another word. The sound of the door clicking shut was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was a sound of finality, of separation. I sat on the sofa, the place where he had held me, where he had kissed me, and I felt a coldness spread through me that had nothing to do with the November night outside. He was gone, and in his wake, he had left a silence more profound and more painful than any I had ever known. The hope that had been so bright just moments before was extinguished, leaving behind only the bitter smell of smoke. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. They were a study in absence. Every text I sent was met with a delayed, brief, and painfully neutral response. "How are you?" "Fine. Work is crazy. Want to grab dinner Friday?" "Can't. Slammed this week." Sorry. He was building a wall between us, brick by polite, evasive brick. The ritual of our evenings was broken. My sofa felt cavernously empty. The silence in my apartment was no longer a space of potential intimacy, but a hollow echo of what I had lost. I tried to work, but the images I took were flat and lifeless, devoid of the emotion I was usually able to capture. My lens could find no beauty in a world that suddenly felt leached of all its color. I was oscillating between a deep, aching sadness and a hot, simmering anger. I was angry at him for his cowardice, for starting something he was too afraid to finish. I was angry at him for making me feel, for the first time in my life, that my love was not just a possibility, but a reality, only to snatch it away. But mostly, I was angry at myself, for letting my guard down, for misreading the signs, for allowing myself to believe that the quiet observer could ever become the main character in the story. I had broken my own cardinal rule. I had risked the friendship, and it seemed I had lost everything as a result. After a week of this agonizing radio silence, I knew I couldn't let it end this way. I couldn't let our years of friendship dissolve into a series of awkward, unanswered text messages. I deserved more than that. He owed me more than that. I needed to see him, to have a real conversation, even if it was the last one we ever had. I needed to understand. I needed closure, even if it was the kind that came from slamming a door for good. So, I did something I had never done before. I went to his apartment unannounced. I stood outside his door for a full 5 minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs. My hand was shaking as I raised it to knock. This was the point of no return. The door opened, and he stood there, looking awful. He was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and he was wearing the same sweatshirt he'd had on 3 days ago. His apartment was a mess, takeout containers piled on the counter, clothes strewn over the chairs. The confident, bright Leo was gone, replaced by this haunted, disheveled stranger. He looked as shipwrecked now as he had the day Sarah left. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw me, followed by a flash of what looked like guilt. "Alex," he said, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "And not over text. Can I come in?" He hesitated for a second, then stepped aside, letting me into the space that felt so alien without his usual vibrant energy. I walked into the middle of his living room, the same room where I had sat with him in the immediate aftermath of his breakup, and turned to face him. "I'm not going to let you do this," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "I'm not going to let you ghost me. For years of friendship, Leo, that means something. It has to mean more than your panic. I'm not ghosting you," he mumbled, not meeting my eyes. "What would you call it?" I shot back, my frustration finally boiling over. "You kissed me. You told me it was me. And then you ran. You ran and you hid. And you left me alone to figure out what the hell any of it meant. Do you have any idea how that feels?" He finally looked at me, and his eyes were glistening. "Do you have any idea what it's like?" he said, his voice cracking. To have the entire world as you know it flip upside down in a second? To look at your best friend, the one solid thing in your life, and suddenly see everything. I've spent my whole life being one person, Alex. I'm the guy who dates women. I'm the guy who was going to marry Sarah. That's the story. And then there's you. And you don't fit the story. And it scares the hell out of me. His confession was a raw, unfiltered torrent of fear and confusion. He paced the room as he spoke, his hands gesturing wildly, the words tumbling out of him as if a dam had broken. He talked about how his feelings for me had been there for a long time, a quiet undercurrent he had deliberately ignored, labeling it as best friendship because that was the only label that made sense, the only one that was safe. He admitted that the comfort he sought on my couch wasn't just about Sarah. It was about being near me, the only person who made him feel whole, even as his life was falling apart. The kiss hadn't created a new feeling. It had only forced him to finally name the one that had been there all along. "I look at you," he said, stopping in front of me, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper, "and nothing else makes sense. But the life I'm supposed to have, it doesn't have you in it, not like that. And I don't know how to reconcile those two things. I don't know how to be the person everyone thinks I am, and also be the person who is in love with you." He said it. The words. The impossible words I had never, ever expected to hear from him. In love with you. They hung in the air between us, terrifying and beautiful and real. All the anger and hurt drained out of me, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. He was a man standing at a crossroads, terrified of the path that led to happiness because it was a path he had never imagined walking. I closed the space between us and took his hands in mine. They were cold and trembling. "Hey," I said softly, forcing him to meet my eyes. "Look at me. There is no story, there is no supposed to, there's just us. Right here, right now. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to have a label for it. You just have to not run. You just have to stay." Tears were streaming down his face now, silent and unheeded. "I'm scared," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I know," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. "I'm scared too. But I'd rather be scared with you than be safe without you." I squeezed his hands. "We can figure it out," I said. "Together. We can be slow. We can be confused. We can be a complete mess. But we have to do it together. Please, Leo. Just stay." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and for the first time since that disastrous night, I saw the panic begin to recede, replaced by a tiny, fragile flicker of something that looked like hope. He didn't say anything. He just nodded, a small, jerky movement. And then he collapsed against me, his arms wrapping around my waist, his face buried in my shoulder, and he held on to me like he was holding on to the only solid thing in a world that had come completely unmoored. And as I held him back, I knew that the storm wasn't over. But I also knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that we were finally in the same boat, and we would find our way to harbor. The resolution wasn't a sudden sunrise. It was a slow, gentle dawn, the light returning to the world incrementally, almost imperceptibly. There was no grand declaration, no cinematic moment where all the doubts vanished, and we stepped confidently into a new life. Instead, our new beginning was built in the quiet spaces, in the small, deliberate actions that followed that raw, painful confrontation in his apartment. It was a process of healing, not just from his breakup with Sarah, but from the years we had both spent hiding from a truth that lived just beneath the surface of our friendship. It was the careful, patient work of learning a new language together, a language of intentional intimacy, where touch was no longer accidental and silence was no longer a space for hiding, but a place of shared understanding. He didn't stay at my apartment that night after our talk. He needed to be in his own space, to start reclaiming it from the ghosts of his past. But as I was leaving, he caught my hand at the door. Will you call me in the morning?" he asked, his voice still fragile, his eyes still shadowed with uncertainty. It was a small question, but it held the weight of a monumental promise. It was a request for connection, a confirmation that the bridge between us while damaged, was not destroyed. It was the first step. Of course, I told him, and the relief that washed over his face was so profound it was almost painful to see. The days that followed were a delicate dance of advance and retreat. We started talking again, really talking. He was brutally honest about his fear, about the disorienting feeling of having his self-perception shattered. He felt like he was grieving a version of himself, the straight, uncomplicated guy he had always believed himself to be. I learned to listen without judgment, to give him the space to be confused and contradictory. I had to learn to be patient, to understand that his journey was not the same as mine. I had spent years living with my feelings for him, my identity quietly shaped around that truth. For him, it was a sudden, seismic event, and the aftershocks were still rattling him. Our ritual on the sofa returned, but it was different now. It was no longer shrouded in plausible deniability. One evening, a week or so after our confrontation, he came over. We sat on the couch, a careful, respectful distance between us. The air was thick with a new kind of shyness. After the movie ended, he turned to me, his expression open and vulnerable. "Can I?" he started, gesturing to the space beside me. He didn't say the rest. He didn't have to. I just nodded, and a small, relieved smile touched his lips. He lay down, resting his head not in the crook of my neck, but in my lap. It was a deliberate choice, a conscious act of trust and affection. My hand went to his hair, my fingers threading through the soft strands, and it felt completely, unequivocally right. There was no pretense of sleep, no ambiguity. He just lay there, his eyes closed, breathing in the quiet safety of the moment. We were rebuilding our intimacy on a new foundation, one of honesty and consent. The first time he stayed the night in my bed was another quiet turning point. It had been a long, exhausting week for both of us, and as he was getting ready to leave my apartment well after midnight, I saw the weariness in his bones. "Stay," I said, the words simple and unadorned. "You don't have to sleep on the couch." He looked at me, a question in his eyes. "Just sleep," I added softly. "That's all." He nodded, and the gratitude in his expression was all the answer I needed. That night, we lay in my bed, on our backs, a few inches of space between us, staring up at the ceiling in the dark. We didn't touch, we barely spoke. But the simple act of sharing that space, of choosing to be vulnerable together through the long hours of the night, felt more intimate than any kiss. It was a silent acknowledgement that we were in this together, a team. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke to find that the space between us had closed. His arm was around my waist, his face tucked into my back, his breathing slow and steady against my neck. I smiled into my pillow and fell back into the most peaceful sleep I had had in years. Slowly, the architecture of our lives began to merge. A toothbrush of his appeared in my bathroom holder. A few of his sweatshirts took up permanent residence in my closet. My photography books started to migrate to the empty spaces on his shelves. We were creating a shared territory, a home that existed not in one apartment or the other, but in the space between us. The fear in his eyes began to be replaced by a quiet confidence, a sense of peace. He started to laugh again, the full-throated, uninhibited laugh that I had missed so desperately. He was not grieving a lost version of himself anymore. He was discovering a truer one. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I found him in my kitchen, wearing one of my old t-shirts, moving with a comfortable, easy familiarity as he poured 2 mugs. He looked up as I entered and gave me a soft, sleepy smile that made my heart ache with a fierce, protective tenderness. He handed me a mug, his fingers brushing against mine. There were no grand pronouncements of love, no dramatic speeches. There was just this, the simple, profound beauty of a shared morning. The quiet domesticity of it felt more real and more permanent than any passionate declaration. This was the life we were building, moment by quiet moment. He leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee, and watched me as I started to get my camera ready for a shoot I had later that day. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I used to think my life was this straight line. A clear path. Graduate, get a job, meet a girl, get married. It was all laid out." He took another sip. And then I met you, and you were this beautiful, unexpected detour. And for the longest time, I kept trying to find my way back to the main road, because that's where I thought I was supposed to be. He looked at me, and his eyes were clear, completely free of the conflict that had haunted them for so long. I was so stupid. The detour was the whole point. The detour was the destination. My camera was in my hand, and without thinking, I lifted it and took his picture. The click of the shutter was the only sound in the room. In the frame, he was bathed in the soft morning light filtering through the kitchen window, a gentle smile on his face, his eyes full of a quiet, certain love. It was the best photograph I had ever taken. It was the image I had been trying to develop all along, the one that captured not just what he looked like, but who he was, who we were. We learned to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. The couch was no longer a place of anxious ritual, but a place of comfort and belonging, our place. The locked room in my heart was no longer a prison for my secret feelings, but a wide-open space, filled with light and the easy presence of the man I loved. He had not just stumbled into my life and rearranged the furniture. He had helped me tear down the walls and build something new, something stronger and more beautiful than I could have ever designed on my own. We had found our way out of the darkroom, not into a world of stark, blinding clarity, but into the gentle, forgiving light of a new day, where the picture of our future was still developing, and we finally had the courage to wait and see what it would become together.